All right. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give us a couple of more minutes to wait for folks to come in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Whoops. Okay. I see everyone's flowing in now, so we'll go ahead and get going. Um, Thank you for everyone for joining us. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Katie. I'm the events manager and op for events and operations for the Green Sports Alliance. We are a membership-driven organization. We exist to leverage the power of sports to promote healthy, sustainable communities where we live, work, and play. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat. And today we're going to learn about how to achieve a return on investment in sustainability in sports. And before I hand it over to our panelists, just little housekeeping items from the Green Sports Alliance. If you follow us on LinkedIn or our newsletter, you would have seen these announcements, but we are officially going to be in Miami for our annual summit from June 10th to the 12th. If you scan the QR code, it'll lead you to our page where you can register. We're doing early supporter pricing right now, which is a 50% discount that will end shortly. So grab your very discounted tickets now. We're partnered with the Intercontinental in Miami, so you can go ahead and book your rooms there as well at a discounted price too. We are also we're holding a few more smaller events per year. If you remember, we were in Kansas City back in September, and we're going to be in Portland on March 18th. This is a topical event, unlike our summit, where we'll be talking about everything. The symposium is dedicated to just reuse. So if you have reuse in your stadium or venue already, if you're a beverage provider, concessionaire, and you're interested in speaking, you can go ahead and email me as well. But if you're interested in learning and if you want to get reuse in your stadium, I invite you to come and listen and learn. And then finally, we have the next webinars in February. We'll be joined by Denali, NASCAR, and Levy Restaurants to talk all about compost and waste management. So now, before I introduce you to our panelists, though, reminder that there is a Q&A box. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, go ahead and put them in here. We will either respond or get to them at the very end. So now let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Antonio Vizcaya. He's the corporate sustainability professor at the Universidad Nacional. Oh, I should have asked how to pronounce this one. Autonoma. And a senior account manager with 17 Sport. We have Christine Cavallo. She's the engagement manager at the UN Global Compact Network, also part of the USRowing Team, or at least once was. And Danielle Doza is the VP of Sustainability and Environmental Services at the Cleveland Cavaliers and Rock Entertainment Group. And Diego Espinosa is the CEO and co-founder of Voiz Academy. And I'm going to send you some more information on Voiz in the chat box, and I'll hand it over to Diego.
Thanks, Katie. So today we're really going to be focusing on, or I'm going to be focusing on my questions, asking these amazing panelists about how we can get to win-win solutions in sports sustainability and defining win-win solutions as those that produce a positive return on the investment that we're making for the initiatives for the organizations that we're working for. And it's like, why? Because I'd like to say, as a kind of like prelude, that even though I'm super passionate about helping the planet, and I run an organization that's basically all about upskilling and career coaching for people that want to come into climate, I also understand that the planet doesn't have a credit card, right? It's like the planet doesn't have a bank account. When we solve problems for the planet, Like there's not like the immediate economic return to doing that. In fact, we all mostly work for organizations that are wanting to that have sales and profits or reduce costs. And so the overlap between these things becomes super important, not just in terms of creating opportunities and managing risk for the business, but also ultimately in having as much impact as most people here in this space, or all of us probably, would want to have. So that's a little bit of the prelude to the discussion as to how we can get to making an argument within sports organizations that there are these kind of win-win opportunities, and we can make things go faster and go bigger as a result. And I just want to say before we jump in, like I can't say that I've like been such a so active in sports during my lifetime, but I have as a fan, and I have to say that like I do think that whatever goes on in sports has an outsized influence on culture and society beyond the impact that can be had within these teams. And that's something that I'm really interested in exploring with the panelists. So with no further ado, I'll jump into questions. And the first one really is around kind of getting a sense of the landscape. So when we think of, if we're not solving problems for the planet directly because the planet doesn't have a credit card, who are the stakeholders that are involved? And what's their level of awareness about sustainability and the importance of sustainability? When we think about these different stakeholders, like obviously the fans, the organizations themselves, even within them, the employees, all the different ones that you can think of. And since this is sports, is it like novice level, amateur level, or pro level of awareness in terms of like what's going on and the importance of doing something for the planet? I'll start with you, Danielle.
Thanks, Diego, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. There are certainly several stakeholders, and I think it depends on the partnership you're looking for, the service or product you're looking for. For us, let's use a service as an example. Say it's a waste hauler or an HVAC organization. You want to think about that ROI. Well, our facility operations team needs to be involved from the forefront, because first and foremost, we need to take care of our operations within the arena, right? We need to make sure we are getting the service we need to provide the best experience for our fans and our team members. But identifying what is it we truly need, and then what value we can provide for that potential partner. And of course, that partnerships team is involved because they want to bring in revenue generation. So we really work within our organization to have these cross-team conversations early on, because the last thing you want is a partnerships team to go seek a partnership and they get down the road and they're excited about something, and then the facility operations team maybe comes back and say, we don't want that or need that, or it's going to disrupt us. So being clear from the beginning about what you need, and then how is it going to create value for all stakeholders, right? It's not just a one-way partnership where, we are paying for a service, they're providing it, or it's an organization paying for marketing. We want to provide value to our partners as well. So it's really trying to involve as many teams as possible, or it's our social impact team if there's social impact involved. So talking early on, what are the needs of everyone? How can we meet those needs? And how can we elevate that work through a partnership as well and make it revenue generating? So that's really what we focus on.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. And Christine, when you think about this, Global Compact has connections with so many businesses, so many enterprises. What would you say is kind of like the spectrum that you see in that awareness, looking into kind of the sports area? How wide is it, and where is it kind of concentrated?
Yeah. So UN Global Compact, for those who aren't familiar, it's the largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative in the world. So every single company that's joined has signed a letter of commitment with their CEO signing off that they commit to 10 principles across climate, human rights, anti-corruption, and labor declarations that are all embedded in international declarations that the UN has put forth. So even in that, where you have a CEO-led commitment, it varies. We have 22,000 participants. There are 22,000 ways in which companies have embedded that sustainability into their operations and what they do. And I think as we're talking about the levels of awareness, I do want to distinguish, because a lot of people are in sustainability because they are so passionate about it, but there is a difference between awareness and excitement. And so the thing that I want to flag sometimes is that there are companies who get a lot done simply through things like employee resource groups, and the way that, you know, someone might be on the legal team or the procurement team or the sales team and like sustainability. And through that way, they're able to tap into that passion side of their work, and it's not formally their KPI. That's great. I'd love for it to be more formally embedded in KPI, so that what Danielle is describing about teams collaborating with each other, it's possible to do that because people are drawn to work together in a formal sense, not out of the goodness of their hearts. But I think that awareness is there and it's growing. And I think when we come to sport, and I have a background as a national team athlete, and a professional career working in sustainability. So my official bridging of these two worlds, I'm in the passion category for that, so I won't speak too authoritatively. But I do know that in sport, you have a very, very captive audience that in a lot of sectors I work with, they are so far up the supply chain producing chemicals or like logistics operators, they're not in the spotlight. And so the work that they're doing, even if it's phenomenal, it's hard to tell their story. And I think that's where sport has an audience of billions. If the teams themselves, the organizations themselves are doing it right, or the companies who are partnering with them are choosing to do it right and give visibility to that work, I think it goes a really long way, in a space where that passion is authentic and can live and breathe there. And it's not, you know, your 9-to-5 job where you have to also choose to pour your heart into it to become aware. So that's my take from the broader corporate side of things.
Thanks, Christine. And I want to come back to that question of like the fans themselves and how they're plugging into this. Antonio, as you've also somebody who has consulted with a number of sports organizations. So what do you see as kind of the landscape of stakeholders and their awareness of needing to do something about sustainability?
Yeah, and thank you, Diego. I think that's kind of like super interesting. And first of all, thanks for kind of like Green Sports Alliance to put together this webinar. I think it's like super interesting because I have been having like a lot of conversation about kind of like measuring the ROI of sustainability, not only kind of like within the sport industry, but this is something very important for like business as a whole, right? I think kind of like the business case of sustainability is very clear right now, but a lot of organizations worldwide struggle to being able to actually measure those benefits, mostly because there's like a lot of intangible kind of like benefits or outcomes that you can get when you are doing sustainability right, that it's very difficult to track, but that's kind of like a different conversation that we might explore later. For me, if you ask me kind of like the level of awareness, I might kind of like divide my answer in maybe three buckets, like thinking within kind of like the different stakeholders within the sport industry, right? For me, first is kind of like team leagues, events, and venues, kind of like sports organizations actually working kind of like directly on the field. I think kind of like, even though sustainability is not the standard right now within the sport industry or specifically with those organizations, I think it's clear to say that we are seeing more and more organizations investing much more on sustainability, right? And it's clear to see that kind of like those forerunners organizations that are leading on the field are actually trying to lead also off the field, right? And kind of like increase their performance, kind of like when they're trying to achieve some social or environmental outcomes, right? So I think it's not the standard right now, but it's growing and like growing super fast. We are even kind of like, and either to say that we are seeing sports organizations being created with like a sole like social or environmental purpose kind of like in the core of the business, right? I don't know, like examples of like Forest Green Rovers, like Formula E, World Surf League. There's like many sports organizations that kind of like the reason of like existing of that specific organization is to actually solve a specific like social or environmental problem, right? So that is kind of like very, very advanced when we talk about sustainability. Then I think moving like to another stakeholder, we can talk about like big brands that are actually sponsoring sports organizations, or those kind of like key stakeholders that are putting kind of like key financial resources, right, to the ecosystem. And I have to say that I can say that most of big sponsors within the sport industry are very advanced in terms of sustainability planning. I think most sponsors have like very robust and kind of like mature teams when we are talking about sustainability. And I am not like assessing if the work that they are doing in terms of sustainability is ambitious enough, but I can say that most brands that are actually sponsors within the sport industry have like a very, very well structured sustainability strategy, right? And it's clear that it's a priority for them, and that they might rely on their investment within the sport world to try to advance their work on sustainability, right? And maybe kind of like the third bucket, which I think it's for me one of the most interesting, because it's actually tapping into the kind of like sport like superpower, just kind of like building on what Christine was saying, which is kind of like the capacity for sports organizations and brands to work together around a sustainability agenda, right? And I think that's also something that is growing very fast. We are seeing more and more brands actually joining kind of, I don't know, like a specific team or something as a official sustainability sponsor, right? So it's clear that what they want to put on the table is to help that specific organization advance their work on sustainability, and at the same time kind of like being able to use that amazing platform to kind of like share that message. So I would kind of like assess kind of like that awareness level within those like three buckets. And I think my key takeaway would be that it's changing very fast, it's growing, and it's clearly like a key part of the conversation now.
Fantastic, Antonio. And that brings to mind, I'm gonna call for a lightning round. So if you had to say who's going to drive sustainability initiatives forward, and some of the people that you all have mentioned and Antonio has mentioned, if we had to say it was going to be the athletes, the fans, the sponsors, the vendors, maybe another group that I haven't mentioned, which is going to be the group in the lead? Who's pulling and who's kind of following? So I'll start with you, Christine.
Oh, wow. You did not prepare us for this lightning round. Gut reaction. I'll kind of go for my track and say companies. I think the companies who've done the R&D, who've done the research, who have the actual product and the thing that they get to highlight and bring in front of an audience that can get really excited about it with the capital to support it and say, look at what's happening. That's huge. I think there's so much grassroots work that's already being done, and it's pushing companies to get to that. And there's always going to be this feedback loop between social pressure, regulatory pressure, and the innovation of the private sector and what it can do. But I think the catalyst that we're in a position to really unlock accelerated change with is going to be the private sector choosing to amplify their work to the sports audience.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Christine. Danielle.
Yeah, I want to say the Cleveland Cavaliers are going to be the leader in this, of course, right? But I think a leader is going to be competition itself. Building on what Christine said is companies that want to get in front of an audience and use the sports platform to elevate their work and sustainability within the sports industry, right? We have very big microphones as sports teams and organizations. So we can use our microphones to amplify messaging. And it's also competition within our organization. So I can work with different partnerships team. We have different folks in our partnerships team who lead different accounts for organizations. So I can go to one and say, hey, I think we should do this with sustainability. And they're like, yeah, we should think about that. Let's get a meeting on the books, and go to a different one and say, hey, we should think about this with sustainability, right? Because they want to compete with each other to have, provide the best value for their account, their accounts, right? So it's that competition within the organization itself. So I love seeing our partnerships team now is reaching out to our corporate partners to set up meetings with their sustainability officers, or sustainability leads to chat with me and, okay, how can we elevate this partnership through sustainability? So it's that internal competition as well as that external competition.
Love it. Sustainability FOMO. Antonio, what about you?
Thank you, Diego. And I have to say that I might build kind of like on the last thing that Danielle mentioned, kind of like how we are going to be able to kind of like improve or enhance our partnership, like putting sustainability at the heart of it. And kind of like we at 17 Sport, we did like a survey a couple of years ago in which we kind of like talk with like many executives, kind of like on the sponsorship arena. And we understand and we found that actually when we kind of like sustainability or like purpose like theme sponsorship deals outperformed kind of like traditional ones, right? So at the end, it is clear that kind of like it's a way for kind of like for brands, for sport organizations to outpace the competition, right? So I totally agree with Danielle that when you understand this sports industry as a very crowded market, it is not easy for you to just kind of like try to just like appear, right? So it's important for you to leverage the different assets that you have. Then I do believe that kind of like brands and businesses are the ones that are going to put like much more pressure to sports organizations for them to kind of like improve their performance, because kind of like you need to walk the walk, right? Kind of like at the end you need to make sure that you're going to kind of like share and advertise in front of millions of people are actually the thing that you're doing. So when you go to the sport industry, you need to kind of like be aware that now millions of people are going to see what you're doing. So I think kind of like once brands start putting some pressure, kind of like, and like putting sustainability at the heart of their kind of like sponsorship, partnerships and stuff like that, that it's going to accelerate a lot the work that the entire industry is doing in terms of sustainability.
All right. It sounds like it's brands for the win. Exciting. Okay, terrific. So let's move on to the next topic, which is trying to get a better sense of like what sustainability means or what sustainability initiatives are within organizations. And so I'd like to start out with like maybe we just go quick and then dive deep just a little bit. And so we at Voiz Academy, often introduce this concept of a heat map when it comes to carbon emissions or some kind of impact. If you thought about a heat map of where your sports team or organizations are having the most, and by the way, when we say impact, a lot of times we have the connotation of like we're impacting the planet. Doesn't mean that someone's trying to have a negative impact. It just means by virtue of running organizations and doing the things that we need to do, there is a byproduct of impact that needs to be reduced on the planet. So thinking of this heat map, what comes up for you as like the thing that comes to mind right away, like when you think of like we're impacting the planet because we X. And so what do you see going on, Christine? You could come from the standpoint of rowing, which I think would be really interesting, or from a much broader perspective, which obviously you're involved with the UN Global Compact.
Sure. So I can put my rowing hat on for a moment. So I've been on the US national team for a little over a decade now. I'm still training for 2028. Recently came to terms with that decision. So I have 4 more years to go play in the water before I hang up the oars. But in doing that, I was tapped by USRowing, which is our global organizing body, to be the ambassador for their partnership with the World Wildlife Fund for a nature positive impact on all of the water basins in which a USRowing event takes place. And in trying to do so, building out that framework so that other local organizing committees are able to deploy it, even if it doesn't officially have the USRowing brand on it. It's essentially a guidebook for major events in the United States that are run by colleges or run by other organizations. They're empowered to go out and do that. One big component there, and this might be a little bit too weird of a buzzword, but if anyone's heard the term glocalization, so global and local, and it's creating this framework so that you can find, and I'm going to tap on one of the questions in the chat or the question box, but finding local partners, whether it's the local zoo who's working on conservation, or it's a like Charles River watershed in Boston who really knows the bathymetry and the water needs and the pollution risks that are very local to that community, and taking this global framework to plug in. And Diego, I don't know if I'm going to perfectly answer all of your question, but I think like it's creating this partnership framework that they didn't wholly have to do. Rowing is not a big money-making, revenue-generating sport. We're not playing with huge margins. Not that many people watch us. We can go into that a separate time, but there's like an existential risk that we don't generate enough views to even remain in the Olympics, right? So the whole like Olympic conversation is evolving towards breakdancing and surfing and really dynamic sports. And rowing is in the crosshairs of that conversation. But what I do know about like the rowing footprint is that 99% of it is scope 3. And I think that's the case for a lot of sport. Their fan engagement and their footprints are very much pushed towards the travel. And there's a very limited amount that you can do to move the needle on where your built environment is. And so when World Rowing approaches that, when they stand up, if it's not like an established venue, which we do have some recurring venues, but a lot of the time we'll stand up a regatta in a body of water that's not constantly used all the time and then build it up and break it back down. And so a lot of the focus that World Rowing puts on that is making sure that the footprint is minimized or even nature positive where it can be. And Diego, if you want to ask a follow-up question, because I didn't completely answer you, please.
No, that's great. That's great. And I actually find rowing exciting to watch on TV. So maybe I'm in the minority, but you know,
I'm biased. So
okay, so Antonio, in terms of the you know, I know you have seen a breadth of activities as well in the clients that you have, but if you had to think of one and like where you think the impact occurs on a heat map basis, where is that?
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm going to be kind of like too abstract in this response, but I think sometimes we focus a lot on trying kind of like to reduce the harm that we are kind of like having kind of like in front of people or the planet. And I learned about like this concept like a couple of years ago when I was reading 7th Generation Sustainability Strategy, and they were talking about being able to understand your climate handprint. And it was like much more of, instead of just like measuring the impact or how you're actually reducing the impact that you're having on the planet, understand how all of your actions are having like a positive influence to kind of like fight the climate crisis, right? So how every single kind of like investment of the company, it's actually using or supporting solve like a specific environmental problem, right? And when I think about that specific concept, applied to the sport industry, I might say that maybe the sport industry is the best position industry to use kind of like that positive influence to accelerate the work that we are doing in terms of sustainability, right? From raising awareness or like igniting it kind of like individual or collective action. I think that is for me kind of like the key thing that you can do, right? If we think about the sport industry, for sure it's not kind of like the most like energy intensive industry or kind of like the most pollutant or stuff like that. And because of that, when we talk about risk, maybe kind of like the sport industry is not going to be kind of like at the forefront of that agenda, because there's like a lot of other industries that hijack that specific position. But if we talk about the kind of like the positive opportunities or outcomes that you can build because of the work that you are doing within the industry, I think kind of like the sport industry, it's in its league of its own, right? And kind of like for me, the key action that you need to do as a sports organization or as a brand working with a sport organization is try to understand kind of like the positive influence that you can have with those millions of stakeholders engaging with you, and try to use that to advance kind of like the entire sustainability agenda, right? That could be, I don't know, like gender equity, inequality, climate change, biodiversity, circular economy, whatever, but kind of like use that kind of like to advance that specific agenda.
So there's a positive impact opportunity, and that's an important one. So Danielle, I'm going to switch gears with my question to you a little bit, and move ahead one, which is that, you know, working with the Cavaliers, there's so many different kind of streams that that come into play. You know, even when you're in a stadium, in terms of Christine mentioned scope 3, which is basically looking into our supply chain for carbon emissions. And so can you describe a little bit, like when you, as a sustainability professional, when you're thinking about the life cycle of a sports event, and going back to like the original rivulets of those streams, like describe it for us a little bit, and you're thinking of what that looks like.
what we think about initially is what we can control, right? Because that's what we can impact the most and the most immediate. So big part of that is waste, of course. I laughed when you talked about what comes to mind when we think of impact. Last summer, I did focus groups with several teams across our company. And my first question is, what comes to mind when you think of sustainability? And overwhelmingly, the first answer is recycling. So there's the saying that waste is a gateway to sustainability. People know what it is, they can see it, they physically produce it and interact with it. And that's something we can really control is, of course, all the materials coming into our arena. Okay, how do we evaluate that? How do we be more responsible with managing that? How do we maybe shift away from single-use plastics? And then we can engage and educate fans and team members on that. So it's a big education piece. While it might be a small part of our footprint, like yes, it is scope 3, but it's also a small part of our footprint. Energy is much bigger. As a sustainability professional myself, I think of our energy and our energy usage. We have a lot of control over that, of course. So how do we think more strategically about efficiency and about procurement of energy? And think about a long scale plan. And of course, we can pair that with a partnership as we do now, right? We have energy partners that are marketing partners. So yes, while we have to pay large energy bills, we also have revenue generation from that. So we try to be strategic about that. And that's, again, that is what we can control. So that's what we are focusing on now. That's what we want to get good at before we can think about those other things that we know we're not so good at right now, but we can be good in the future. But hey, let's focus on within our 4 walls. This is what we can do. This is how we can make an impact. And just, quick addition to that is working with our partners within the community. So thinking about that direct community impact. So we have our Trees for Threes program as an example with the Davy Tree Company. So they sponsor for every 3-point shot made during the season, a tree is planted right here in Northeast Ohio. So we can go see those trees. We do tree planting event. We know the organizations who are going to get trees, whether it's our local park system or the Girl Scouts who are going to plant and take care of those trees. And now we're working with them on, okay, how do we collect some data? How can we talk about the long-term benefits of that program and, eventually expand it. And hey, the Cavs are doing really well this year. We got a lot of 3-point shots. So I'm really excited about a lot more trees we'll plant next year.
I can picture the fans shouting tree every time somebody sinks a 3-pointer. So that would be exciting. Maybe you can get that going, Danielle. So, okay, great. So, one of the things that we're talking about today is kind of like this intersection between the business side of things and the sustainability side of things. And honestly, when people at Voiz Academy ask me like, what's hard about learning about sustainability, I always answer, it's like, it's not what you think. It's not necessarily the technical jargon of scope 3 and things like that. It's basically finding that intersection of the possible within business goals and sustainability goals. And so I'd love to hear from you just to kind of set the context, like for people who may not be as familiar or just in your own kind of context of what you know about. When you think about a sports KPI, like, what is it? What is it that like people get up in the morning thinking about, oh, I've got to do this. And if it can be a couple things or 3 things if you need to. But what would you think about as kind of like a classic sports KPI? And Antonio, you've consulted with a number of companies, again, like mentioning that. What do you think is out there as like what are sports firms trying to achieve from a business standpoint that they measure?
I think kind of like if we talk about kind of like in a specific sport industry, like working with business or kind of like at the end, what like sports want to achieve, like by doing some work in terms of sustainability, I think kind of maybe the most important thing for me that I want to consider when I'm thinking about a specific business KPIs is kind of like the intangible assets. When we think about kind of like how actually kind of like the market value of organizations are actually defined or determined, we know now that most businesses are actually assessed or valued because of the intangibles assets that we have, right? The brands. And I think that's even a bit more important when we talk about kind of like sports organizations itself, right? So even when we think about like the most valuable assets of a specific sport organization, I don't know, you can think about the Olympic rings from the IOC, right? It's one of the most kind of like valuable intangible assets of the world, right? So I think kind of like for sports organizations, kind of like keep building that specific brand awareness and affinity, and it's key for them, right? To grow that specific assets. Then kind of like if we understand and sorry if I'm like jumping the gun a little bit here, but if we understand how actually sustainability is going to be a key lever for you to kind of like improve the performance of those specific intangible assets, then kind of like the business case, it's just like super clear, right? I think kind of like the next question is, okay, that's perfect. The business case is like super clear. I think the tricky part is how to understand, how to measure those intangible benefits from those specific assets, right?
I was going to ask you about that next, but we'll get to that because that's always, you know, the issue with brand value and as a KPI. Danielle, what about you?
Yeah, you know, there are the traditional that everyone asks. Are you tracking your waste? Are you tracking your scope 1, your scope 2? And you know, those are the ones we focus on. A lot of, I'd say, stakeholders outside of the sports industry ask about fan travel, which I totally get because it is a large impact. It is also a pretty large undertaking to try to try to track that. So it is, you know, and oftentimes it's not very exact data. So that is a really difficult one to think about. So we are thinking internally about those KPIs, and when we can track those kind of internal operational KPIs, again, everyone can understand it and see it and say, okay, we can set some goals and targets. And when we reach those, then we build more champions within our organization because they see us achieving those milestones. And again, they can see ROI on a lot of that. And then we can share that with other stakeholders. So a lot of it is about that control and then just getting down that data piece. And sometimes you have to try to pull data from several different folks within the organization, which can be difficult. So just getting that system in place, I think, is something people should focus on rather than trying to think really big. Right? What can you control and manage and really focus on? Get that down, and then you can start thinking about other things. And again, like say it's the travel piece. Well, then people say, okay, what are you going to do with that data? Are you going to offset? It's hard to make the case to spend money on offsetting something that we don't necessarily have control over. There's no real ROI there when we can invest in something else and see that ROI. So again, you have to make those cases, even though other stakeholders might want to see you working on something. You know, we have an ism or a philosophy in our organization called ignore the noise, where a lot of people might be talking about one thing, but it's not necessarily going to help us achieve our goals or our mission, and we have to stay true to our mission. So we try to ignore the noise and focus on really what is going to bring us the most value and our stakeholders the most value.
Definitely. Thank you, Danielle. So Christine, when you think about KPIs that are out there that sports organizations are trying to meet on and especially on the business side, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I like the ignore the noise with Danielle. I think, and again, I am very cross-sectoral in my expertise, so I don't have the fine-tooth comb of doing it myself as Danielle does. And Antonio's worked with a lot of companies who are across this space. So when I say in aggregate, I think some of the really helpful frameworks I see companies using, and again, from my point of view with the UN, are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. It's quite easy to find at least one that is like, you have to be doing some pretty bad things on this planet to not have at least one of the 17 SDGs aligned with your business model. In fact, we usually see the opposite. We'll have a company come to us and say, we mapped to 15 of them. I'm like, that's way too spread out, way too thin, no chance. Let's take one of our courses. Come on, just come check it out, see what we have. And normally companies will come and actually slice it down to the things that they can control. And I think to Danielle's point, focusing on where you have ROI that's maximized, that is most aligned, where you can really lean in and have impact and move the needle. So we're seeing companies actually narrow to points of where they have outsized leverage. And within the UN Global Compact, we've found across the SDGs, there's 5 areas there. It's climate action and their science-based target or their commitment to emissions reduction. It is water resilience and the impact on the basins where they operate, their water positive approach. It is SDG aligned or sustainability aligned finance and investment, making sure that when they commit funds to things, they're thinking about how it tracks with their sustainability goals. And that requires an internal KPI between your finance team and your procurement team and your sustainability team, and probably a lot of other teams that are making those finance and investment decisions. And then I think I said 3, the other 2 are living wage. So obviously companies are going to be the ones setting those wages and doing that analysis through their supply chains and their due diligence process to making sure living wage is, where it needs to be. And then gender equality. So all the way up to the highest levels of leadership, how are you advancing gender equality and representation? And those all have huge multiplier effects of, positive revenue for the company. We've seen that and studied that. But those are 5 areas that I think I've seen across the KPIs. Most companies are able to lock in on and say, yeah, we can attach to 1 or more of those 5 and lean into them in a way that's relevant for our sector and our business and our angle.
Interesting. So the SDGs are still like a relevant menu of KPIs that might be most impactful for an organization. Antonio, I want to come back to in the context of understanding how to make the case for sustainability with respect to business objectives, right? So when you're out with the stakeholders and trying to get support for the initiatives that oftentimes require a decent amount of investment or personnel or whatever. Antonio, you mentioned brand value, and especially with the intangible portion of it. And very often what happens as an ex-finance person, I didn't discuss my background, but I used to be an investor and a Wall Street analyst that used to basically take management to task for not producing enough profit. So Antonio, when you talk about building brand value, very often the finance department will be like, prove it. And so how do you prove that sustainability initiatives create brand value?
Yeah, I think that is the question, right? Kind of like at the end, there's like a lot of like research paper that kind of like showcase kind of like what is the benefit of like sustainability. And I'm going to put like a big disclaimer and a big like parenthesis, like sustainability done well, right? Because not all sustainability initiatives are going to create value for the business if you actually do not work with sustainability in a very, very kind of like strategic manner, like putting like enough like planning and thought behind it. Actually, it's proof that sustainability can actually destroy value for brands, right? If you are not working right. But I think at the end, kind of like when we are talking about intangible benefits within that business case, right? When I having like conversation with like different businesses and we try to prove what is the business case about sustainability, there's like many things that we can talk. I think kind of like the most known one are kind of like those operational benefits, kind of like reduce costs, like improve efficiencies and stuff like that, right? And then when you go to those intangible assets, specifically for brand value, there are like many things to consider, right? Kind of like for brand value, you can start like thinking a bit more about employee engagement, right? And understand how the work that you're doing in terms of sustainability, it's going to improve the perception of like employees or potential employees to actually go to work for you. And that is key for businesses. I was like reading a survey like a couple of weeks ago, and it was like saying that one of the main reasons for businesses to invest in sustainability is to increase employee engagement, because kind of like shortages of talent is one of the most relevant operational risks for businesses in the short term. So they want to make sure that they are attractive enough for future employees for them to come and work with them, right? But how we are going to be able to measure that, at the end, kind of like you need to start putting together a baseline. When you understand that your value as a brand is relevant for you, you need to start assessing kind of like, and just like start with like a day 1 and day 10, right? And there's like different methodologies that you can use to actually start measuring that, like from consumer surveys, like social media analytics, like net promoter scores, like I don't know, like behavioral data. There's like a lot of like different tools, and I'm not going kind of like to list all of those. There's like a lot of tools that you can use to assess the performance of your brand, kind of like as a internal and external perception, right? So what you need to do is kind of like you need to start measuring that, and then once you start working in sustainability, include like sustainability KPIs within the key questions that you are measuring in those type of tools. So you are going to understand how the work that you are doing in terms of sustainability is actually increasing the perception, right? But for sure, it's like a process, right? You are not going to being able to do something and then the next week you're going to be able to prove that that there's like a benefit. I have to say that at least right now, there's like a lot of really relevant research that support this, right? So you're not starting from scratch. You know it's going to have that benefit. You just need to make sure that it's well planned and well executed.
And thank you, Danielle. And Danielle, you mentioned, you know, the brands, the sponsors, and so what I'm wondering is like when you're having discussions internally with teams, how often does it come up that like if we do X, we'll be able to, you know, increase our value in some way? And then I also wonder like what typically is a common barrier to having that conversation that you can think of.
Yeah, we're still working out how do you really assess the value of sustainability aside from some dollars and cents of some sort of, you know, contract, right? You know, what is that value? And part of that is just whether it's engaging a current or potential partner to understand how do they value sustainability? You know, what might it look like to them if we promote their sustainability, and what is that value to them? So having that conversation to understand, again, how can we integrate that into a partnership? Or it is working with our finance team or whoever to say, okay, let's think a little bit longer term. And you know, I just feel really lucky to work for my organization who does understand that sustainability is valuable generally. And we need to consider this. And simply because one thing is less expensive than the other doesn't mean that's always the right decision, right? We are not afraid to explore other options that might not be the cheapest if it brings us that value in other ways, whether it's our brand value, you know, and we are thinking about, okay, how does sustainability help us elevate our brand value as a sports organization, you know, within sports, or maybe it's even capturing a new audience who may not have thought about it, or maybe they didn't pick a team, but hey, I like what you're doing on sustainability, so now I'm going to be a Cavs fan, or, you know, we have a hockey team as well. So it's the potential to capture some of that new audience as well, I would say, when you're thinking about brand value.
And then yeah, that raises kind of the obvious question of you know, for a sport like basketball, are we talking about making sure that we continue to bring in younger audiences, maybe bringing in more diverse audiences, more women watching the sport or attending sports events? I don't know what that makes is like. I haven't been to a basketball game in a long time.
Absolutely.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
We have a pretty robust business intelligence group at our organization that looks at a lot of data for our fans, our partners, and everything. So we have a lot of data already we can look to, but it is okay. Who else might we be able to bring in? Whether somebody is coming to the arena, or they're going to watch a game on TV, or maybe they're going to buy something from our retail shop. And so, you know, retail is a great example for us as how else we can promote sustainability. So one thing that I love about our organization is we are really great at that intersection of fashion, culture, and sports. So how do we use that to elevate sustainability? So for example, we just launched a t-shirt and a sweatshirt that's fully traceable. Right, it's our first real sustainable item in retail space. So the cotton is grown in Texas, it's milled and dyed in Pennsylvania, and it's sewn right here in Cleveland, Ohio. Right, so it's domestic, fully traceable, and it supports the local economy with a local fashion company right here in Cleveland. It is cool. It's only available to buy in person right now. It's not a scalable thing, but it's something we said, hey, this is really cool. Our retail team had a really fun time working on it, and we got to promote it through our culture partnership as well. So what else can we do in that space where maybe somebody is thinking about fashion and like, okay, I want to buy some Cavs gear. Oh, you have a sustainable item. I'm interested in that, right? Or it's someone who wants to buy sustainable fashion, and now they're going to look at the Cavs because we have something available. And, we're looking at a lot more opportunities within that space.
Really interesting example. I'd love to have a sustainable hoodie. Yes, and Christine, you're also kind of like at a broader level trying to speak to corporates with the UN Global Compact. So how do you think about this kind of issue of margins and sales and all these other different things?
Yeah. So like to the question you initially posed to Antonio, it's pretty proven that sustainability creates brand loyalty. Some studies in the last 4 years have highlighted that over 80% of companies who put sustainability practices in place are reporting improved customer retention, and over 85% are saying it's improving their brand image. We know it also impacts your talent recruitment, and kind of in a subtle way, something you don't really necessarily think about until it's happening, but like a lot of these initiatives are ending up impacting the diversity of perspectives in your boardroom and across your teams, because you have more inclusive perspectives in the room telling you, hey, like I think we could tap this market in this way. And so it's adding like a more complex thought structure to a lot of leadership conversations as well, especially when we're going towards more equitable boardroom representation. And I want to zoom out a little bit and cover the last 20 years in 30 seconds, but we know that companies with, I don't really want to throw around ESG because I think it gets a little bit of a bad rap in the US sometimes, but sustainability practices, we know that those companies outperform companies that do not have them over the long run, and that this is critically amplified in times of crisis. So whether it's the 2020 pandemic or the 08-09 financial crisis, companies with good governance and good social practices and environmental awareness that is embedded into their systems of operation seem to perform better. It's almost like remembering the world that they exist in is enough to mitigate the shocks when those shocks inevitably happen. And for anyone who's a climate nerd in this space, the planet's getting warmer. We know that. What we don't really recognize through that average warming is that there's a lot more volatility. So the freezing cold we've experienced in the US the last couple of weeks, the fires, the floods, the hurricanes, all of that is really destabilizing. Those freak natural events are going to keep happening with greater frequency as the world continues to warm and air weather patterns change and everything kind of mixes in different places, and the ocean slows down because it's getting warmer and doesn't turn over cold water as much. Like there's all these crazy complex systems. The world's going to become more crazy. And so companies that are resilient towards that are going to be in a really great position. So yeah, that's my 10,000 foot 2-decade view on this.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much when we have crises like that, stadiums tend to figure into them in one way or another, right? In terms of the crisis response. So we've seen that time and again, kind of an interesting dynamic. So, without getting into details about the political climate, which waxes and wanes around sustainability, but a couple of questions we're getting into Q&A now related to this. Is it going to slow things down? And rather than kind of generalize, I'd love for you to think about, like in the own work that you do, is it impacted by it? And will it slow down, speed up, or is it just kind of like a consistent trajectory no matter what? Danielle, I'd love to hear from you.
So one, we're a private company, so we don't have some pressures that other public companies might have, but this is really top of mind. This morning, we just held a breakfast event here at the arena with local sustainability leaders group. So we have the largest regional chamber of commerce in the country called Greater Cleveland Partnership. There are a ton of large companies who are part of it. And the sustainability leaders group is several large companies. We come together, have conversations, and we show up, and that's really important. And the Chamber of Commerce is reiterating that they are committed to it because all of our companies are committed to it. And a lot of those companies are our corporate partners as well. So it's a nice cross section that, we talk to them, and it is the work we've been doing for a while. It is the work we're going to continue to do because, again, it is good for business. Some of those public companies are international and they have other international pressures or reporting requirements, so that, that plays into it. But we are all about community impact as well at the Cavs. We have a 12-person social impact team on our staff. So it is huge, and they do a ton of community work. We are talking about how sustainability fits into that. Tree planting is part of that, but we are going to grow that here over time. And just a bit of an aside, we had Pride Night last night at the Cavs game, and our Chief Impact Officer reiterated to a group who was there to celebrate Pride that, we're not going anywhere. We will continue to celebrate Pride and support the community because that's who we are, and that's those are our values. So we just continue to live our values as an organization, and again, ignore the noise. We're going to keep doing what we're doing.
Awesome, Danielle. Great to get that insight. So another question is around disclosure. What trends are you seeing in disclosure? Maybe Antonio or Christine, you could speak to this. Are we starting to see increased levels of transparency? Is this something that you get involved in? Antonio, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that is kind of like one of the big trends, right? When we're talking about sustainability, and even though we are seeing like some kind of like important like changes, like mostly kind of like within the US at a federal level, I think when we are talking about like sustainability on a global basis, kind of like transparency regulations are increasingly, and that is kind of like exponentially. I think like just like to put an example, right now, and I think that happened just like today in Mexico. It was just like announced like a new decree, kind of like mandating public companies to report sustainability performance based on the ISSB kind of like norms published a couple of years ago, right? We are kind of like seeing what is happening in Europe with the CSRD and the ESRS. We are seeing like something similar in Asia with like a lot of sustainability reporting. It is kind of like even like very complex, right? It's kind of like the ESG kind of like acronym universe, right? And it's very difficult to kind of like just keep the pace on it. But at the end, kind of like for me, it's important to know that this is not going anywhere, right? At the end, all of those regulations and all of those kind of like requests for transparency comes out for a reason. Kind of like mostly investors are actually pushing to have like much more information and better information, because even when we think about how businesses are actually managing risks, they need to be able to kind of like just disclose a bit better how they are actually managing those, right? And that's kind of like information that is key for investors. Just kind of like reading like a research that was just like released a couple of weeks ago. I think it was like mentioned that the NFL stadiums were kind of like they had like a 11 billion risk because of like climate disasters, like stadiums within the NFL. So those problems are not going anywhere. Investors and many stakeholders are actually very interested to understand how businesses, including the sport industry, are actually managing those risks. So at the end, disclosure, reporting, and transparency, it's going to keep growing, right? Because that momentum is not going anywhere.
Okay, great. And I think we don't have time for more questions, but I just wanted to mention that for those of you who are interested in climate upskilling, sustainability upskilling, as I mentioned, I run a platform that does that. There's a link in the chat. If you're interested in our programs, we upskill people in decarbonization and sustainability work, and also offer career coaching. So a little bit of a plug for Voiz Academy. And I just want to say thank you to the panelists. Great discussion. You've really given us insights into what goes on directly in the sports area, which is not something that you hear about every day. And so from my side, really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you so much to the Green Sports Alliance and Katie for co-organizing, and I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thanks, Diego, and thanks all of the panelists. There's some really great questions in the Q&A box. Unfortunately, we are very out of time. I'm going to stay on and try and answer some of these, but for everyone else, I just want to thank you for coming. I did put my email in the chat, so if you want to have further discussions, feel free to email me and we can get a meeting on. There's also from the Voiz Academy, Diego, who was our host today. He's the CEO and co-founder. But if you want to book some time with his company, the link is also in the chat as well. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And this webinar will go live in the next couple of days. If you missed it, you'll get an email. And hope you have a good rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.